Thank you so much for being here. I'm DeEtta Jones. You choosing to tune into this webinar signals at least an interest in learning and gaining guidance on what you can do to have more impact as you navigate a complicated and changed environment. So with that assumption in place, I'm honored beyond words that you're here. As you can see, we're in a little bit of a unique setting. For those of you who I interact with pretty regularly on Zoom, I am today in the studio. So you have the benefits of full studio production, and you also have some of the quirkiness that comes along with that. So along the way, there may be some hollering back and forth from the folks who are behind the cameras, but we also want to make sure that you know that even if we are trying to make sure that we're giving you the highest quality production level experience, that there also is going to be plenty of opportunity for questions and engagement along the way. So over the course of the next hour, I want to really pull back the curtain on some of the frameworks of the best-in-class equity, diversity, and inclusion implementations and some of the sectors in which our team brings decades of perspectives. So libraries, mid to large corporations, some not-for-profits. This address will be packed with real-life case studies that you can't find on the public internet. The insider information I'll share with you draws on over 30 years of working with some of the strongest brands in the world. I walk through real-life examples and detail the framework that is being used today by these cutting-edge organizations. At the end, we will open up the floor for live questions and leave you with a checklist that you can utilize in your organization to take your strategic next step, confident that you're leveraging the processes and the techniques being used by some of the very best in practice right now. So if you're an HR leader in a mid to large organization, or the director of diversity and inclusion at a library, or an executive director of a not-for-profit, this address is for you. My promise is that you will get valuable, actionable framework that you can begin implementing in your organization tomorrow. So let's start here. True to the journey related to equity, diversity, and inclusion that we are all on, I'm going to begin by telling just a little bit of my own story. I have spent all of my adult life and even some of my kind of adolescent life navigating the complicated topic of identity, starting with myself. I'm the daughter of a white mother and a black father. My mother is one of 10 children. She grew up as a Jehovah's Witness in a little town called Zion in Illinois. She lived in relatively poor neighborhoods and went to schools that were predominantly black and brown-skinned students. My mother, by contrast, is very fair, right? She has blue eyes, she has blonde hair. Her skin never tans. She freckles, she doesn't tan. And she's told me a million times about growing up longing to have the beautiful skin or some of the big personalities like so many of the girls around her. My father, on the other hand, grew up in a little town called Marianna, Arkansas. I've spent years counting how many aunts and uncles I have, always trying to get the count just right. I think there are 15 in total. As you can imagine, with a family of that size, he grew up in relative poverty and with racism as a normal part of his daily existence. By the time my father was a teenager, he had ventured north to live with relatives on occasion, and then sometimes with generous strangers. In the north, right, as in Illinois, he witnessed financial prosperity, he saw interracial relationships, he was exposed to possibilities for his own life beyond what he had ever witnessed in the South. All the messages, the subtle and overt messages told to him about being black made him really think that being black was a limitation. And so it was from these vantage points, my mother's and my father's, that my parents met as teenagers, and they fell in love. They were both looking for something, and they found exactly what each other needed at that time. They needed the opposite of themselves. So they went on to have me and my 4 sisters. My mother got her brown babies. My father got access to a bigger life. But from early in my childhood, I remember struggling with my own identity. I often heard racist comments that were made by some of my own family members, or I had to pick sides during race riots at school. I was bullied for acting too white. The world is shifting now, but I'm old enough that being biracial wasn't yet in style. So Halle Berry, Tiger Woods, they hadn't been, in the public spotlight yet. People like me weren't really popularized yet. My road to college was rocky, but early in my time as an undergraduate, I received exactly what I needed at that moment, a teacher. Just like in Joseph Campbell's famous hero's journey, an unexpected person appeared and guided me through some of the most tumultuous developmental experiences of my life, and some of the most gratifying. My teacher became a friend. She became a trusted advisor, a mentor, a coach. She helped me look inward, and she also helped me look out. She helped me push beyond the boundaries of my own limited exposure and my own limited courage. It was at this point that I became crystal clear about my own purpose. I wanted to help end oppression in the world. The following 30 years were filled with a lot of effort on my part to do just that. I was a campus and community activist. I created and facilitated training programs on equity, diversity, and inclusion at a university. I was the director of the Human Rights Office for a city government in Colorado, where one of my major accomplishments was helping to pass an ordinance that placed violence against people in the LGBTQ communities as hate crime. I was a director of diversity initiatives for a North American not-for-profit serving the research library professional community. I designed and traveled the world facilitating leadership and managerial programs for university faculty and staff. And in 2005, I launched DeEtta Jones and Associates, a consulting firm that provides equity, diversity, and inclusion training and strategy. Over all of those years, I've worked with hundreds of organizations and tens of thousands of people. Regardless of what is so prominently the focus of the news, my personal experiences have been overwhelmingly heartening. People in my personal experience are mostly generous and well-meaning. More than anything, the people who seek us out at DeEtta Jones and Associates are people very much like myself 30 years ago, knowing that something isn't right, but not necessarily equipped with the knowledge or the tools to act, and in need of a teacher. So let's talk for a moment about what the broader problem is here that we're trying to address. The world that we are navigating today, it's complex, it's dynamic. So even when I'm trying to sum up what the world of work is in 2022, it's difficult to know where the borders are, right? Work used to be a place where certain things happened. Those were deemed professional. And other things didn't happen, right? Those things were deemed personal. Those lines have been blurred for years, but with a lot of pushback by people rooted in the US and Western cultural norms and the models of management that were created for and by white men. This isn't a statement against white men. Just think about it. The people who have been most acknowledged as the seminal thinkers of management and organizational cultural literature have come from white men. Peter Drucker, Stephen Covey, Edgar Schein, Michael Porter, Tom Peters, Peter Drucker, Peter Senge. These teachers laid a foundation of a world of work that created order. It created repeatable processes. It created a means of measurement and growth that worked well for people like them and in contexts that were designed for people like them. Even as recently as mid-2021, I remember talking to a group of executives about shifting workplace cultural expectations, and they said, all of this emphasis on how people are feeling is totally outside of the bounds of work. I can't believe that we're even entertaining these discussions. Those sentiments are now much less prevalent, as we are almost 3 years into an entirely new era, and there are a lot of opportunities for action. For example, there continues to be a persistent gap in the pipeline for women in the workforce. There's a broken rung on the first step up to managerial levels for women, a trend that's been persistent since 2016. Women's far lower rate of promotion than men makes it nearly impossible for companies to lay a foundation for sustained progress at more senior levels. Additionally, the gains in representation for women overall haven't translated to gains for women of color. Women of color continue to lose ground at every step of the pipeline. Between the entry level and the C-suites, the representation of women of color drops off by more than 75%. As a result, women of color account for only 4% of C-suite leaders, a number that hasn't moved significantly in the past 3 years. And in the past 3 years, there's been a lot of attention on it. In addition, management and leadership, the pandemic has also taken a disastrous toll on the representation of women overall in the workforce. During the pandemic, women have exited the labor force at twice the rate that men have. Their participation in the paid labor force is now the lowest it has been in more than 30 years. About 1/3 of all mothers in the workforce has scaled back or left their jobs since March 2020. According to a 2022 Forbes report, 2021 set an all-time high for corporate class action lawsuit settlements. The law firm that conducted the study, Seafarth and Shaw, said that the stakes in these types of employment lawsuits can be extremely significant, as the financial risk of such cases are enormous. More often than not, class actions adversely affect the market share of a corporation and impact its reputation in the marketplace. It is a legal exposure which keeps corporate counsel and business executives awake at night. As for entrepreneurial endeavors, people like me, which seem to be on the rise, a recent Bloomberg report shows that venture capitalist funding for women and people of color-owned companies has only increased from 3% to 3.2% since the murder of George Floyd and the present-day racial equity movement. Again, a time when there's been a tremendous concentration of effort and commitment and resources, and still the gains are almost non-existent. The state of equity, diversity, and inclusion in the world isn't just about systems that span decades back or are seemingly outside of your control. No matter where you are in your career, you are in a more precarious position than ever before. Just think back over the past 5 years alone. Yes, there are egregious acts like the murder of Ahmaud Arbery by neighbors who felt entitled to hunt down a black man out taking a job in his own neighborhood. But there are also countless other examples that are far more nuanced. Right, so the Starbucks CEO, Howard Schultz, recognizing that racism is a major problem, and with determination to do something, asked baristas to engage with customers to write "race together" on coffee cups. Or sexual misconduct claims dating back more than a decade were made against a visible and powerful faculty member at the University of Rochester. The university, after an investigation, found that he had not broken the letter of the law. Students and other members of the campus community, however, held fast to their expectation about ethical and moral standards being the true bar. Joe Rogan, an incredibly influential media personality, catalyzes a boycott of Spotify by big-name artists amid years of using racial slurs that were not previously challenged. Cornel West, one of the nation's foremost black scholars and outspoken progressive activist, has announced his resignation from Harvard University, accusing the school of intellectual and spiritual bankruptcy of deep depths. The examples go on and on. In many of the cases I'm highlighting, there are people like you and me working inside of structures for whom one of the following was true, right? A, they were trying to do one thing, but actually had a very different impact than what they intended. B, they didn't actually know what they were doing was out of bounds at the time. C, what they were doing wasn't technically out of bounds at the time. Or D, they were just playing their part inside of a larger organizational system over which they had a limited line of sight, authority, or gumption to actually challenge. The most complicated, of course, are the people who actually believed that what they were doing was right-minded and values-aligned, like I believe was the case for Howard Schultz, for example. Regardless of their intentions, their actions landed poorly in the time, and the times in which they were operating have changed now. So even behaviors from the past, as in the case of Kevin Hart, were fair game for now public criticism and even penalty. So I'm not sharing these glimpses to paint a bleak picture. As a person who's dedicated 30 years of my life to advancing equity, diversity, and inclusion, I'm grateful for the convergence of national and global issues, from the pandemic to racial reckoning and climate justice, that have forced us to this point. I'm thankful. For too long, we've been like the proverbial frogs in the water, with the temperature rising, but never enough incentive to actually force action. The question you are likely asking yourself at this point is, where are we going next related to equity, diversity, and inclusion? So that's where we will focus attention for the remainder of the talk. First, though, let's talk about where we're coming from, how we've done it in the past, lest we make the same mistakes again. The cycle of diversity, for the most part, has been relatively knowable, repeated, and broken, at least in US companies and in many other organizations, for about 50 years, according to my count. Here's how it happened. It always started with a triggering event, right? So remember a few years ago, the bus with a bunch of white students singing about lynching black folks was captured on video and shared? Remember the huge brouhaha in the media? What did that university do? They immediately kicked into overdrive. They hired a consultant to help them with crisis management. They immediately put out statements denouncing the behavior. They formed a task force on campus to investigate the pervasiveness of similar activities. Were these students really learning these songs as part of their fraternity pledging process? They hired a person, or sometimes appoint a person, who already has another full-time job, and then they give them an extra 50% workload associated with doing diversity, whatever that means, right? And then they wait. The task force creates some recommendations. The person who has been appointed goes out to a lot of meetings, put out a lot of statements. They try and try. They're like Sisyphus pushing a rock uphill with their nose. But one of two things always happens next. Either the person is a superstar. They are super successful and they get recruited off to another place in the wake of some similarly egregious triggering event, or the person, the singular person, burns out or is deemed ineffective because they failed to make the kind of quantitatively measurable transformation that is expected of people who have no idea of the enormity and complexity of the task or a willingness to appropriately resource it, let alone how to measure it. In either of these scenarios, the outcome is exactly the same. Everyone says, "We tried," then moves on to the next burning topic of the day, which is followed by significant lull in activity or into full-on hibernation. Business as usual continues to prevail until, of course, the next triggering event occurs, and then the cycle repeats, right? So you can easily imagine what I'm going to say next. We have to go forward. We've done the same thing over and over and over. What we have done until this point clearly does not work. Doing more of it is not strategic. So here I'm going to pause for a moment. I'd like to check in with you. So if you're near your device, please take a moment to reply to a super simple yes or no anonymous poll. Here's the question. How many people resonate with this broken cycle of diversity that I just described, right? So this broken cycle where we have a triggering event, we hire a person, we get a task force in motion, we try to no avail because either the person leaves or nothing happens that is demonstrable enough for us to count it as a win. And we say, you know what, we tried, and then a lull ensues until the next triggering event. How many of you resonate with that? Using the polling feature in Zoom, you should just see pop up on your screen. I'm going to ask you to either select A for yes, that is absolutely familiar, or B for no, that this cycle is not familiar at all. I have no idea what you're talking about, DeEtta. So I'm going to pause for 30 seconds, and I'm going to ask you to complete this quick poll just so we can see. Oh, well, that was quick. I can see. Everyone says, yep, got it. Not everyone. We have a couple of no's. I'll wait in case there's any additional comments. Okay, well, that's what I thought. The broken cycle of diversity is all too familiar to most of us. And the fact that we haven't put into place a better model after all of those years of failed attempts is ridiculously frustrating. It shouldn't have to take the total shutdown of a society due to a pandemic, coupled with the constant influx of news about horrific and ongoing acts of oppression, to catalyze new behavior. But here we are. And the question is for all of us is, what do we do next? Going forward is going to mean a total reconceptualization of what we're trying to accomplish. There are different schools of thought about this, right? So some people think, like Daenerys in the final episode of Game of Thrones, that burning it all down is the only option. Corruption, toxicity, racism, oppression are so baked in to the very fiber of our cultural fabric that no other option is even viable. That's the most radical perspective. Much further to the right is the notion that nothing is wrong, and that all this fuss about equity, diversity, and inclusion is actually causing harm. It's actually the root of the polarizing world that we're all living in. This is a naive perspective that reflects what's described by interculturalists as minimization. In essence, it's the idea that we're all the same and that talking about differences should be avoided. Somewhere in between is where things like open letters listing demands of industry leaders and the Great Resignation falls. There are hundreds of thousands of people who are giving up on a culture that is squeezing the humanity out of them. The people who are poo-pooing the cultural confines that have been binding us, they're not necessarily of one political party or another. There are people who have been marginalized and undercapitalized for far too long. They've not been fully seen or recognized for so long, and they don't see a brighter tomorrow by just hanging in there longer or willingness to accept the incremental progress. These are also people I am focused on right now, right? This is where I believe we have the potential to really have an impact. The fact that people are speaking up in coordinated and amplified voices it's intimidating at first. It makes people who have been in power feel exposed. If you're such a leader, I invite you to redirect your thinking. Yes, exposure is absolutely the goal, but it doesn't have to be a personal affront. Instead, use this opportunity to do meaningful work that drives cultural transformation. The new work takes what has been relegated only to volunteer labor or siloized within human resources, and it integrates authentically and sustainably into core business functions of your organization. This total transformation is based on, one, total behavioral and structural overhauls, two, a firm and action-oriented commitment by leaders, people in authority, and three, shared accountability for integration and measurable outcomes across all business functions. I mean all business functions as in every single thing that is the core of the reason that your organization exists. Here's the tricky part. Actually doing what I'm calling the new world of work is going to be a lot different than what we've ever done in the past. This is not the time to be looking in the rearview mirror. identifying all the things that you haven't been able to accomplish with limited, sustained focus and effort, and now making a commitment to just double down on doing more of those things. More of the wrong things is not strategic. This new paradigm is about how equity, diversity, and inclusion can and should exist within an organization and how that's moved. In the word of the brilliant bell hooks, right? From margin to center, things have shifted. What we call this is enabling equity. Enabling equity means that equity, diversity, and inclusion cannot be relegated solely to the work of human resources or other volunteers who are doing the heavy lifting related to EDI off the sides of their desks. Enabling equity is an organization-wide strategy with clear lines of accountability within all business functions, with measurable performance goals that demonstrate how EDI drives core business objectives, dedicated financial resources, and executives and managers with responsibilities for lines of business who are at the helm, driving performance and ensuring measurable progress. The Enabling Equity Framework, developed by DeEtta Jones and Associates, is founded on 4 elements that balance internal and external focus: organizational culture, leadership and managerial effectiveness, brand and reputation, and business products and services. Within each of these elements, we work with our clients to customize the associated work streams. So for example, a work stream with brand and reputation might be related to supplier diversity, or social impact efforts, or industry awards, or other externally communicated measures like Great Places to Work or the Human Rights Campaign. Some of the most sweeping systems changes that are happening within business products and services, where the core work of companies being implemented, who are implementing this approach, are totally overhauling their work streams. They're changing the ways that they gather customer intelligence to take into account the significant bias that's been in the market segment profiling, or the way that we have intake forms that ensure that customers are able to identify fully and openly, or that we have an equity lens that's applied to questions related to identity, or that equity lenses ensure that EDI outcomes are included in all scopes of work. Changing technologies and systems to require inclusion of cultural nuances in the actual technological customizations. I'll give an example here about why this particular work stream is so important. We recently worked with a firm that has as one of its clients the United States Postal Services. The firm was asked to create advertising for newly released stamps, many of which include historically significant women and people of color. The strategy team, the people responsible for gathering the information about the scope of the project and then handing that scope over with the specifications to the creative team, who was going to actually put together some designs, went about their work the way that they always had, asking questions about timeline, budget, target audience, methods of communications, etc. This information was given to the creative team, who in turn developed a beautiful and animated commercial that displayed each of the new stamps. The final product was given on time and on budget back to the client. The client loved it and signed off, right? Everything's good. Then the advertisement went live, and the Postal Service received thousands of letters of complaint. In the ad, the stamps were stacked on top of each other, right? And a woman of indigenous descent was placed at the bottom, as was a black woman. The ordering of the stamps symbolized blatant racism and sexism to some people who were perceiving it, an ingrained implicit bias to a lot of others. You've seen this happen before plenty of times, right? Remember the Dove commercial just a couple of years ago that showed darker-skinned people before use of the soap, and then the images of getting lighter and lighter after they washed away their excess dirt? These are the kinds of mistakes that aren't really relegated to one person being blatantly racist. These are the experiences that are associated with failure to build in equity lenses at every stage of the work stream. And that is what's happening within organizations adopting the enabling equity framework. They are building in equity lenses and other processes to ensure that equity, diversity, and inclusion is taken into consideration at every step of their ideation, communication, design, and handoff process. One of the most exciting ways that this enabling equity approach is achieving breakthroughs is by forcing coordination across what have been more siloized activities in many organizations, right? So in the example I shared, the strategic and the creative teams are now collaborating to redesign their intake process, as well as work side by side through the design process. In addition, new capacities within the organization are being created. Namely, business resource groups are being repositioned as consulting groups rather than volunteer or service groups. So that's just one example, and hopefully it gives you something really powerful to kind of latch onto and to imagine for yourselves. So for you, what does the pursuit of enabling equity look like in an organization, right? In the wake of the murder of George Floyd, there was this wave of kind of mass call-outs in various industries that have been particularly exclusionary. And in representation, there is significant lack of Black folks or Indigenous folks or people of color, especially at managerial and C-suite levels. This happened in a number of industries, and I'd like to share an example. Some of the industries that this happened in, this mass call-out, were academia, publishing, healthcare, advertising. But I'll share an example here from an advertising industry client. It's a great example. The global spending, just to kind of frame this out a little bit, on advertising is about $600 billion a year, and the industry has been criticized for a lack of gender and racial diversity, particularly at the most senior levels. In the US, Black folks make up about 13% of the population, but only 8% of employees in the advertising and public relations sector, according to a 2019 government survey. In 2020, following the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent launch of the racial equity movement that we are continuing to be in the midst of, more than 600 Black advertising professionals in the United States signed an open letter urging industry leaders to address systemic racism in the sector. They said a pervasive boys' club mentality stifled the growth of Black employees, and that a failure to track diversity numbers made it impossible to tell what progress, if any, had been made. This is where our firm enters the picture. We had established relationships with a number of executives in that industry, and with a strong foundation of trust already in place, which made us obvious collaborators through what was a real storm. We partnered with CEOs who had been directed from the top of the advertising world to change their representation numbers at the senior levels, and then answer the very specific demands laid out in that open letter, and then integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion to support internal agency culture while also transforming their creative solutions for clients. That's a tall order. It's also one of our most proud breakthrough experiences, where we found an amazing partner who was ready and able and willing to do just that. They were ready and did rise to that call. They decided to really put their money where their mouth is, and they are creating an enterprise-wide equity, diversity, and inclusion strategy that is absolutely unique to them, that is entirely new as far as a model. It breaks beyond the bounds of what equity, diversity, and inclusion has been in other organizations because it is embedded at the core of every one of their business functions. This model comprehensively includes traditionally internal functions like HR, training, business resource groups, all the way to clearly external-facing functions like industry awards or creative solutions for clients. More importantly, we've worked with them to create a detailed and then cross-referenced map that ensures that equity, diversity, and inclusion integration at all levels, individual, team, business unit, and all the way up, is integrated. So let's zoom in on how this EDI integration impacts some of their vendors. So all of the RFPs for the company's new HR technology system and their learning management system now requires vendors to add gender-neutral language and phonetic name pronunciation without additional costs or without clunky customization. Vendors that supply images for use in print, like Getty, have partnered to ensure a broader range of images is available when a creative team requests options for people of color, or for multicultural, or for Native American. Right? Casting agencies are required to demonstrate that they have more racial representative models for commercials, avoiding overrepresentation of racially ambiguous people with light brown skin, or binary gender identification, or limited body type. To underscore, the kinds of changes that I'm describing here are the result of a comprehensive strategy. They require enterprise-wide level consideration of goals clearly that move beyond HR only and cannot actually be implemented without people in the agencies understanding how to make them happen. Somebody has to write or rewrite those RFPs, right? Somebody has to create the specifications that will go to the vendors with sophisticated ability to know what to ask that will be different for casting agencies as opposed to producers or directors or graphic designers. This sophisticated ability to implement EDI strategy at the level of the day-to-day work, that takes cultural competence, and they know it. So in addition to our work with them at the enterprise-wide EDI strategy level, this agency has also put every single one of their managers across the entire globe through our Inclusive Managers Toolkit. The benefit of this, of course, is that every single person who has responsibility for leading others in the organization or allocating resources also now has a foundation of knowledge, shared tools, and clearly understood expectations about their role in driving EDI strategy. They know that equity, diversity, and inclusion proficiency, it's not a nice to have, it is actually core to their work. So, as you can probably tell from the look on my face, I am in love with this organization. They are on fire, and I'm honored beyond words to be part of their journey. Their organizational culture is one of the healthiest and most vibrant I have ever seen. They've grown significantly during a time of great tumult. Their employees they report high levels of engagement even during one of the most painful years in workplace history across the globe. And their clients are coming to them to offer creative solutions that leverage their strengths in equity, diversity, and inclusion. They've actually developed EDI capacity that they are delivering to their clients because of their internal commitment. So this example demonstrates a new model because it goes well beyond employee engagement, hiring, representation goals. This business-centric approach shifts the gravitational pull from EDI being pushed by a small faction as the right thing to do to being actually pulled into the day-to-day work. It also illustrates that contemporary EDI strategy cannot be successfully implemented without broad and sophisticated intercultural competence across the entire organization. So to reiterate, right, the new world of work takes a comprehensive approach to equity, diversity, and inclusion, from individual skills and behaviors to full integration into all business and HR functions. It shifts EDI from being in addition to our real work to being central to everything we do and how we do it. In this new world of work, EDI is not a cost center, it is revenue generating. Therefore, it is prioritized, it is measured, and it is valued. One of the other major shifts that's happened and is happening is that we are moving from episodic learning and development to enterprise-wide capacity building. So another component of our new world of work is this ongoing emphasis on learning. The ways in which most of us have experienced learning has been either in formal structures like a degree or a certificate program, or through structured professional development experiences like company-sponsored training or conference attendance. The most common approaches are always episodic and fragmented, right? So you're going to learn about this specific topic for this specific context. Then when the need surfaces, we send people out to learn about the next topic du jour for the use in the next context du jour. And this cycle goes on, and there are a lot of problems with this model because perhaps most prominent is that it doesn't align with how learning actually happens, nor how organizational culture is actually conveyed. In the new world of work, learning is ongoing and enterprise-wide. It is not limited to functional expertise, but actually prioritizes what have previously been either considered soft skills or siloed, like equity, diversity, and inclusion. The purpose of learning is to ensure that all employees have a shared baseline of knowledge and repertoire of practices and tools. Employee engagement is one means of measuring impact, but only a slice of the larger pie. Right? Larger implications are on employees' abilities to actually implement in every role and at every level of an organization equity, diversity, and inclusion reflective behaviors that impact how products and services are designed, how services are delivered, how your brand is recognized, and how the workforce pipeline is continuing to be brimming over with coveted talent. Moving to enabling equity, right, the framework that I described earlier, means that everyone is going to be uncomfortable first. The absence of comfort means that we are pushing ourselves beyond the places that we've been. We're developing new muscles built around a future narrative. One of the most important and new elements of this framework include, as I've mentioned, distributing what has heretofore been solely the focus of HR to clear responsibility within the lines of business. This is a major shift for managers and executives who may have cared in the past or even had loosely enforced performance incentives for diverse hiring goals, to now having much more rigorous expectations for driving EDI through all aspects of their product development or service offerings processes. This point makes me think of Malcolm Gladwell's book, Outliers, in which he introduces the infamous 10,000 hours rule. Right, so the rule goes like this. It takes about 10,000 hours of intensive practice to achieve mastery of complex skills and materials, like playing the violin or getting as good at Bill Gates as computer programming. One step further, people who are managers and leaders within your organization are likely expected to and rewarded for being masterful at their job. They have likely invested the requisite 10,000 hours, but with one caveat. The job is changing. So even if their title hasn't changed, the nature of their core work has and is and will continue to change. Their 10,000 hours is not behind them. It's not behind any of us. Enabling equity is going to require managers and executives to not just provide training for their staff, but also to be deeply immersed in their own learning. I don't mean taking a course on implicit bias or microaggressions or adding pronouns to your email signatures. Those are absolutely a starting point, but no high fives or fist bumps if you haven't gotten beyond them, right? Managers and executives should be deeply involved in the thoughtful examination of your business functions and asking questions like, how is unintended bias keeping our team from achieving the kind of breakthrough thinking we desire? Not if bias exists and lives in our work streams, but where and what tools can we use to root it out? And where in our products or service delivery can EDI be fully incorporated and then communicated to our clients to help us differentiate ourselves within our industry? This model for organizational integration of equity, diversity, and inclusion and anti-oppression is what I want to share next. And I'll also give you an example of how this model of integrating equity really works in one of our client organizations. So about a year ago, the executive director of a highly regarded philanthropic organization contacted my firm, DeEtta Jones and Associates. He's a man who has for many years genuinely been investing in what I call doing his own work. He is solidly an ally and committed to making sure that the organization is on the razor's edge of contemporary best practice. He wants to create a model that enables others to act. He does not want to be performative, but he wants to make sure that he is putting himself in a vulnerable and highly accountable position that makes room for others. So our team began working with this organization in a threefold way. We were doing some internal capacity building with the entire staff to make sure every single person on the team understood where it is that we're going and was developing shared language and understanding of how it is that we were going to get there. This means helping them come to a shared level of sophistication about their own values, about how those values are often challenging to fully enact in their industry, like philanthropy, that has a long history of white supremacist ideals and practices as part of its legacy. The second way that we're working with this organization is to create an enabling equity strategy that aligns their values with their work streams, their HR practices, and even their philanthropic and performance goals. And then third, and this is really important, we are also providing coaching to the entire leadership team and the executive director personally and confidentially to help make sure that they have the support to truly understand and integrate the work into their decision-making and resource allocation. This is the part that's often missing. This model, integrating equity, is about connecting the typically disparate pieces of the work of EDI and ensuring that leadership, people in authoritative roles, have the space to confidentially explore options for action and the challenge and the responsibility to actually act. I have to say this enterprise-wide capacity building has been powerful to witness in practice. You're likely familiar with the pressure associated with impatience, right? People are impatient for action. They want to know now what their leaders are doing to understand the issues, and they want to know that their leaders are taking decisive action. So having the space for strategic, practical, and also tactical, confidential coaching for leaders has been a game changer as far as ensuring that EDI work has a continued and visible place of prominence in the organization. So we've talked about a lot of things, and I've introduced several models and shared some examples with you. What I'd like to do here is pause for the remainder of our time and invite you to ask questions and to explore some of the issues that brought you to this place today. And so for now, what I'll do is I'll just ask our production team to open up the room and to make sure that if anyone has a question, you're able to unmute and come on camera and ask it, and then we can talk a little bit more about next steps.
Oh, thank you, David. My name is Whitney Celestin. I'm the new Equity Program Officer for the Boston Public Library, and I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much for putting this together. My question is around naming the models that we use for these programs. So when you think about DEI, EDI, JEDI, what do you think about the naming, the acronym? How do we come about it? Because that's important for me in the work that I'm going to be doing at the library. So if you could please advise, share your thoughts, and I also ask that we poll on that if that's possible, because I love that we have a large group of people, and that would be enlightening for me. So thank you.
Oh, I love that. So thank you so much for being here, first of all. And I love the question because naming something is incredibly powerful. As a mother, I know how incredibly important naming was to me when I was trying to figure out how to approach that with my son and his name. I do feel like every organization takes a slightly different approach, and I find myself using language differently because so many different organizations have different approaches. I do understand that, different organizations start with JEDI, with justice, that a lot of organizations include A for accessibility, a lot of organizations include B for belonging, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I actually think it would be brilliant. We don't have a poll that's already constructed, but I do think it would be brilliant if people would be willing to, in the chat, maybe share what your naming is for your organization so that we have a full array of options available to us to consider. I also think that the naming is really important to do very intentionally and with the group of people who will be kind of leading, at least initially, because there's a lot of tumult I've found in the naming itself, and it forces clarification. Everybody says, oh yeah, I understand EDI, DEI, accessibility, justice, social justice, but when you actually get a group of 5 or 10 people around a table and say, let's define this for us, and then let's think about, once we put this definition into place, it is also putting us at a level of a bar that we must now commit to enacting, then all of a sudden that naming conversation becomes very different, right? And so the word justice is a very different word than, accessibility, is a very different word than diversity. And so if you're gonna put justice in your name, you better say, this is what we mean by justice, and this is how we are going to commit to this all the way through. And so we have to make sure that that naming process is really done with intention, and that once you name it, you are also committing to following through on that name. And so it's a really, really powerful act, just the naming itself. I personally believe that the naming should happen at the local level because it forces a commitment to action, and it forces a kind of accountability for saying, this is the bar we are establishing for ourselves. But I also encourage people to push themselves. If you're wrestling with justice or social justice or accessibility, I'm going to encourage you to wrestle through that and not to give up early and just rest on the laurels of what other people around you are doing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for that question. And I wish you well. I know you have important work in front of you and that you're doing it already.
I think Blaine's hand is up.
Hi, DeEtta.
Hi, Blaine.
I just have a question. I love that you gave percentages and the low numbers, and they haven't increased and they're not changing over, not just the last generation, but the generation before that. What can we do to actually encourage young people of color to, number one, diversify the fields that they go into, diversify their majors, and number two, go on to advanced degrees? Because if we don't do that, those numbers are never going to change.
I absolutely agree. So listen, y'all, we have to take a moment here and just say, Blaine is one of my mentors. He's one of the early mentors and teachers and guides in my life. I met Blaine when I was 17 or 18 years old, and he has guided me and challenged me and helped me grow all these years. So thank you for being here. I love you so much. Here's the tricky part, Blaine, as you know this, that people are exiting. People are almost choosing the opposite. They're like, you know what? These systems don't deliver on the promises that they keep dribbling and drabbling around and dangling in front of us. And so there's this mass exodus of the systems that we actually need to reform, that we need to change. And I think that instead, and I know that there are different schools of thought about this, I actually believe that there's so much power in having the education, having those degrees, having that presence, having that positional authority to make decisions, and then having the support around us to actually have those breakthroughs. So I think that some of the things that for me, I was advantaged by was having people like you who gave me a glimpse of what it looked like to have an advanced degree, what it looked like to educate myself around history and around systems and around what it looked like to actually create a path that may not exist already, but I have the potential to help open up the doors for. But I also benefited tremendously by being around a lot of other folks who had more privilege than I did, racially speaking, right? I had a lot of white folks who had positional authority and had access to things, resources, jobs, opportunities, sometimes financing, that kicked doors open for me, that allowed me to have impact in places that I wouldn't have otherwise. And so for young people who are frustrated, I would say, look, come find those of us who are here with more positional authority, with some of those resources that we want to share, and we will do this together. But don't extricate yourself altogether. We need you. We need to do this together.
I thank you, and that's a perfect answer, because there has been no social movement in the history of the United States that didn't require white support. Thank you.
And all I want is to know that I got the answer right, Blaine. This is my college professor. Thank you so much. You're right. It's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us. One more. Let's do one more. Anyone else? Okay. So if you haven't yet, I would absolutely love to have those names dropped in the chat. I can't see the chat from where I'm sitting, but I'm going to just ask you to go ahead and generously drop those names in the chat so that we have access to those, so that you have access to those. And what our team will do is we will collect those variety of names, and then we'll send them back out to you so that you can easily have access to them, so that when you go back to your organization and you say, let's start talking about what some of our naming choices might be, and you say, you know what, we don't have to do any of these, but it's good to know that we at least need to make a thoughtful choice and have an intentional process. And what this process will result in is setting our own bar of accountability. Let's jump in. Having something to start that conversation will be helpful for you. So we'll share this with you happily as a follow-up. And then we also want to, just as we kind of wind down this time together, make sure that you know that if you're interested in putting into practice any of the approaches shared in this talk, we would love to hear from you. And we would love to connect with you, be on your journey with you. We are all on a journey. This journey can be personal. It can be related to the position that you hold in your organization. It could be about trying to really bring a strategy or really reallocate resources inside of your organization. Regardless of your starting point, just get started. And there is, as Blaine said so perfectly, there's room for all of us. Another takeaway is for you to look at the checklist that we're providing here. It's just one of many tools and tips and resources that we want to continue to make available. It's a simple way for you to perhaps reflect with your team on where your organization is to date, and then imagine where you want to go. Hopefully inspired by some of the ideas that you've heard here today. And then finally, of course, I invite you to CultureRoad. CultureRoad is a place where you can get started immediately and over time, learning, exploring, integrating your inclusive values into your daily practice. Again, thank you so much for being here, for doing the work that you do, for sharing in this journey with all of us. Look forward to continuing to work with you and go and keep on making it happen. Thank you.